Hello, my name is Michael Locke, and I work for U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. I'm here to talk today about post-disaster displacement and receiving communities in the United States. The topic of post-disaster displacement in the United States and the resulting challenges for both the people displaced and the receiving communities where they resettle. The objectives of this module are to explore what is internal displacement, how are different groups affected by mass displacement, what determines the outcomes of mass relocations, and why do displacement events sometimes lead to conflict? Human displacement is any situation in which people are forced from their homes or communities, either for their own safety and well-being, or because they're given no other choice. Displacement can be devastating as a personal concern in its economic and psychological effects, such as increased poverty, homelessness, and post-traumatic stress. As a social concern, the disruption caused by a large displacement event means the displaced people at risk of being marked as an outsider group in the areas where they subsequently live, which can lead to conflict. Displacement is thus a homeland security concern because it increases social vulnerability, raises intergroup tensions, and could potentially destabilize entire communities. Displacement can have many causes, from large-scale crises like war, conflict, or environmental catastrophe, to more local and personal events like evictions, domestic violence, and housing degradation. But this module will focus on natural disasters as commonly understood in the United States. The causes of such disasters can include severe weather events like storms, floods, tornadoes, and fires, slower onset climate events like drought and rising sea levels, geophysical events like earthquakes or volcanic eruptions, and environmental degradation from pollution or invasive species. Recent disasters like Hurricanes Katrina and Maria, Superstorm Sandy, and the spate of wildfires across the western U.S. have all led to large-scale disruption to habitability for neighborhoods and communities. Over 1 million Americans each year have to evacuate their homes, whether temporarily or permanently, to avoid the effects of disasters. In general, internal displacement involves 4 actors: the people who are displaced, the sending community, the receiving community, and the government. 2 of these actors are the focus of our attention here. First, there's the group of people being displaced. Recently, the term climate refugees has come into fashion to describe people escaping environmental catastrophes. However, in US and international law, refugees are people who cross an international border seeking safety from persecution. The term internally displaced people, or IDPs, is more flexible, since it does not matter what the cause is, and more accurate, since it refers to people within their home country. While it is most frequently used to describe people in the developing world, it is also appropriate here. Second, we are interested in the receiving or host communities, the places where IDPs resettle. Because we are talking about internal migration within the country, the principle of freedom of movement for citizens or residents assumes that people have the right to go any place they can find shelter. Thus, regardless of where the disaster-struck sending community is, any place may become a receiving community. The response of the receiving community can be thought of as a sliding scale, from positive or neutral responses like welcome, acceptance, or indifference, to casual negative responses like resentment, avoidance, and open hostility, to serious negative responses like restriction of rights, criminalization, and physical violence. These are not abstract fears. During Hurricane Katrina, some communities set up physical blockades to prevent evacuees from finding even temporary refuge. In response to the Dust Bowl migration, California passed an Indigent Act that made it illegal to assist poor people relocating to the state. The Supreme Court quickly found it unconstitutional. On multiple occasions, states and localities asserted grounds for denying migrants from disaster-affected areas access to voting rights and housing programs in hope that they would simply go away. These responses are fluid, as an initially welcoming community may develop and display resentment over time, eventually target the newcomers with punitive measures to push them out. Some of the reasons for different responses include the visibility of the newcomers as a cohort, structural challenges inherent to communities receiving large numbers of newcomers, and the exploitation of moral panics to scapegoat newcomers for those issues. Depending on the characteristics of the disaster, the people displaced by it may or may not end up as clear outgroups of new arrivals in receiving communities. If a large number of people arrive quickly or require the construction and use of emergency shelters for an extended period, their presence becomes more salient. In contrast, a relatively small trickle of arrivals that is able to find and afford housing on their own will go largely unnoticed. This can be thought of as a visibility versus anonymity difference. Another consideration is how far the receiving community is from the sending community, both geographically and culturally. People in communities directly surrounding the disaster-damaged community are likely to have more direct connections to the disaster's victims, and thus to feel sympathy for their harder-hit neighbors. Overall, in post-disaster situations, those migrants who lack economic resources or social connections within their host community are most likely to become salient as a distinct class of internally displaced people, or IDPs. The presence of a large cohort of displaced people in a host community does not automatically lead to conflict. Rather, there are a number of inherent or situational factors that may make conflict more likely. One recently developed framework for understanding these factors is called Sociofunctional Analysis, which matches different perceptions of the situation with different emotional responses. If the residents of the local community assume that the newcomers are competing with them for resources, such as housing or public funds, it may lead to aggressive and even violent responses. By contrast, if the newcomers pose some threat to public health or safety through a real or perceived increase in communicable disease or criminal activity, the community may shun them or restrict their movement. Oftentimes, the threat a community associates with a cohort of newcomers reflects an issue or bias that was already prevalent or important locally. For example, during the Dust Bowl, many rural communities in California were already grappling with farm labor exploitation when a wave of laborers from the Midwest arrived. And in Houston, the police department was already suffering setbacks prior to the arrival of the supposedly crime-prone Hurricane Katrina evacuees. This does not mean that all concerns around absorbing large numbers of displaced people are unfounded. Mass shelters frequently play host to disease transmission, as with recent outbreaks of norovirus following the 2018 Camp Fire in Paradise, California. Further, the rapid arrival of many newcomers can suddenly overwhelm the housing market and create an affordability crisis where one did not exist before. However, local actors such as media outlets or aspiring political figures may leverage ordinary fears to extraordinary ends and artificially inflate threat perception within receiving communities. This is a classic form of a moral panic, where a neutral or minor matter is spotlighted to such an extent that the attention thrust upon it overwhelms its real-world effects. In summation, the phenomenon of post-disaster displacement in the United States engages with a number of complex issues in American life. The principle of freedom of movement, the reality of precarious economic circumstances, the public health and safety dangers inherent in large-scale transitions, the competition for scarce resources in growing communities, and the ease with which perceived fears can be stoked. All of these factors together contribute to the development of internally displaced people as a stigmatized class and the possibility of conflict in their receiving communities.